Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome back to Guys and Magic. This is Hunter and David. Say what up, David.
Yo, what's going on?
We are back this time taking a look at another bigger budget upgrade of the Lost Caverns of Ixalan Precon decks. Once again, we are looking at the vampire one called Blood Rites. Isn't that right, David?
That is absolutely right.
That's absolutely right. Before we get into the additions, I just want to remind everybody to check the description for the $100 upgrade for the Blood Rites deck. However, David, you are taking this $300 upgrade in a different direction. Isn't that right?
That's true. For the $100 upgrade, I decided to stick with the face commander of Clavileño. However, for the $300 upgrade, I have actually chosen to switch gears on this one and build it around the secondary commander, which is Carmen, Cruel Skymarcher.
All right. I totally am interested to see how you built this deck. Again, if you guys wanted a Clavileño deck, I think the $100 upgrade to that deck makes that deck hum just as well. And you can add some more money into that. But I'm really interested to see how Carmen Cruel Skymarcher is going to make this deck even better. So talk to me about what this card does and kind of the direction you're taking the deck.
Yeah, so the face commander Carmen is 3, a white, and a black for a total of 5 mana. It is a legendary creature, vampire soldier, and it's a 2/2 with flying. It also says whenever a player sacrifices a permanent, put a +1/+1 counter on Carmen, Cruel Skymarcher, and you gain 1 life. Then it says whenever Carmen attacks, return up to 1 target permanent card with mana value less than or equal to Carmen's power from your graveyard to the battlefield. So there's a lot to unpack with this card. So on the surface, 5 mana for a 2/2 with flying isn't necessarily anything all that special. However, I really love just how big this thing gets and just how quickly it grows. So one of the things that I want to point out here is it's whenever a player sacrifices a permanent. So that's going to be whenever you sacrifice something or whenever your opponent sacrifice things. So what we're going to be encouraging people to do with this deck is just to sacrifice all of their things. And for those of you who've been around for a while, I mean, I'm sure at this point you've probably noticed that people sacrifice stuff all the time, whether it be some of their artifacts for just general abilities. Sometimes people will sacrifice lands to be able to go and fetch. And then, of course, this happens to be a set with a ton of new treasure support, which means that Carmen's getting more fuel added onto the fire. So there is a lot really going on over the course of a game that's going to make this creature just absolutely massive. And it should gain you quite a bit of life as well. The other thing that I love about this is that this is also a very recursion heavy deck, and that your commander is just going to be grabbing things from the graveyard and putting it directly back onto the battlefield for you to reuse any kind of like ETB or just like bring back any of your really pesky and annoying creatures that your opponents have to deal with.
All right, you've sold me. Sounds like some reanimator, some making your opponents get rid of their stuff shenanigans when making this huge and potentially flying with evasion. Hit for commander damage, question mark? Sounds good.
I mean, that is our game plan.
Yeah, alrighty. Well, let's see what you've done to the deck. Let's start off with your additions. Talk to me about some of these creatures you're throwing in to make this deck better.
So to focus more around Carmen, I am just going to go ahead and just like a little bit of a disclaimer here is that this deck does still have a very large number of vampires in it, but Carmen actually doesn't care about the vampire tribe specifically. And with that being said, obviously we still have quite a bit of vampires here, but the deck isn't really necessarily focused around that specific group of creatures. So we're going to be moving away with a lot of our inclusions. The first group of creatures that I want to talk about, I'm going to read through them first, and then I'm going to explain why they are all included in the deck, because they kind of function all pretty much identically and do the exact same thing. So we're going to be including Fleshbag Marauder, which is 2 and a black for a creature zombie warrior. It is a 3/1 and says whenever it enters the battlefield, each player sacrifices a creature. Plague Crafter is 2 and a black for a creature human shaman. It is a 3/2 that says whenever it enters the battlefield, each player sacrifices a creature or a planeswalker, and each player who can't discards a card. Merciless Executioner is 2 and a black for a 3/1 creature orc warrior. It says whenever it enters the battlefield, each player sacrifices a creature. Demon's Disciple is 2 and a black for a creature human cleric. It is a 3/1 that says whenever it enters the battlefield, each player sacrifices a creature or planeswalker. And Slum Reaper is 3 and a black for a total of 4 mana for a creature horror. It is a 4/2 and says whenever it enters the battlefield, each player sacrifices a creature. So the really cool thing about all of these cards is that if your commander is in play, you can drop these creatures. Everybody is going to have to sacrifice based off of these cards' ETBs. So you're going to get 4 sacrifice triggers, which means you're going to also gain 4 life and put 4 +1/+1 counters on Carmen. Then, assuming that Carmen is able to attack that turn, if you do attack with her, you can reanimate one of these creatures. So they'll come back in, get a second ETB, forcing everybody to sacrifice an additional thing, putting 4 more +1/+1 counters on Carmen and gaining you 4 more life. Essentially, this is a way for you to, for either 3 or 4 mana, kill off 6 of your opponent's creatures and swing in with a 10/10 with flying while also having gained 8 life.
Yeah, that sounds pretty nuts, man. I like that little combination a lot. That seems pretty wild.
Yeah, using these creatures, I mean, Carmen is going to get very big and very difficult to deal with. And a 10/10 with flying that only has to hit your opponents probably twice in order for them to just like kill somebody is pretty impactful, especially considering, I mean, like this is commander damage and it's not going to be a whole lot of a stretch for you to just be able to pump her up that one additional power to knock somebody out at 21.
Yeah, for sure. That commander damage is very easy to hit with Carmen, it seems. What are some other creatures you're throwing into this deck?
So the next group of creatures are all creatures that are relatively cheap, provide utility, and have sacrifice abilities stapled onto them that are just going to like be there in the case that we need it, while also providing like that extra degree of flexibility. So the first one here is going to be Selfless Spirit. This is 1 and a white for a creature spirit cleric. It is a 2/1 with flying that you can sacrifice, and it says creatures you control gain indestructible until end of turn. So this is a nice little way for us to be able to protect Carmen while also making sure that we are going to be gaining life, and then also making her indestructible until end of turn, as well as the rest of our creatures. So we can sacrifice this, give her a nice little boost, make her indestructible, attack, and then get Selfless Spirit right back onto the battlefield, which is going to make Carmen very difficult to deal with. Kami of False Hope is a single white mana for a creature spirit. It's a 1/1 that you can sacrifice to prevent all combat damage that would be dealt this turn. Now, obviously, you don't want to sacrifice this and then swing in with Carmen, but this does act as kind of like a repeatable fog effect. If our opponent is swinging in with a bunch of creatures, we can always sack Kami, which will pump up Carmen. It'll prevent us from taking any damage. And then on our next combat, we can swing in with Carmen and put Kami right back into play. Very similar to that one is Children of Corliss. This is a single white mana for a creature. It is a human rebel cleric. It is a 1/1 that you can sacrifice, and it says you gain life equal to the life you've lost this turn. So this kind of puts your opponents into a really weird situation where if they don't have enough power in play to just knock out all of your life total, they're not going to be able to kill you because you can sacrifice Children of Corliss and then just be able to gain all of that life back, resetting your life total from what it was at the very beginning of the turn. And then once again with Carmen, you can kind of, it's not necessarily like a loop per se, but I mean, you make it very difficult for your opponents to kill you. And then we also have Selfless Savior, which is a single white mana for a creature dog. It is a 1/1 that you can sacrifice, and it says another target creature you control gains indestructible until end of turn. This is just another way for us to make sure that Carmen stays in play.
Yeah, all 4 of these creatures, name of the game. Sack 'em, protect. That's I get it. It synergizes really well with your commander. It's pretty nuts. Speaking of protection, what are these guys?
Speaking of protection, if you haven't gotten it yet, it is super important to this deck that Carmen be able to stay alive. Specifically because, I mean, we don't want to be able to have to recast her a couple of times over the course of the game. She already starts off at 5 mana, which is kind of expensive. And coming down is only a 2/2 means that if we are having to pay that commander tax and reset a lot, it's going to be a huge pain for us to slow us down. So we're going to be throwing in Mother of Runes, which is a single white mana for a 1/1 human cleric that you can tap. And it says target creature you control gains protection from the color of your choice until end of turn. We also have Giver of Runes, which is a single white mana for a creature core cleric. It is a 1/2 that you can tap, and it says another target creature you control gains protection from colorless or from the color of your choice until end of turn. This is more protection, and in the case that your opponent does happen to have maybe a flying blocker, we can just tap down either Mother or Giver to give Carmen protection from whatever color that blocker might be, so that she just swings in and beats face.
Yeah, 2 of the best protection creatures in the game. I can see why they're being added here.
The next 2 creatures generally are just really good whenever it comes to sacrifice-focused decks. The first one here is Woe Strider. This is 2 and a black for a creature horror. It is a 3/2 that says whenever it enters the battlefield, you're going to create a 0/1 white goat creature token. It has an ability where you can sacrifice another creature to scry 1. It also has an ability where you may escape it by paying 3 and 2 black, as well as exiling 4 other cards from your graveyard. And then lastly, it says whenever it does escape, it enters with 2 +1/+1 counters on it. So there's a lot going on with this card. Really, the big thing, the reason why I love this card included in this is because it is a free sacrifice outlet that provides you with sacrifice fodder. The other big thing here too is that you're never going to have to escape this because Carmen can pretty easily get up to 3 power. She just needs a single +1/+1 counter on her, and then she can start looping Woe Strider in the case that your opponents deal with it. The other card here is Morbid Opportunist. This is 2 and a black for a creature human rogue. It is a 1/3 and says whenever one or more other creatures die, draw a card. This ability triggers only once each turn. There is that little caveat where you're not going to be drawing a ton of cards over the single turn with that. However, this cares about any creature dying. So even if your opponents, maybe opponent A attacks opponent B and opponent B chump blocks, you're still going to be able to draw a card off Morbid Opportunist. And with this having several sacrifice outlets in the deck, we should be able to pretty reliably make sure that we're able to sacrifice things on our opponent's turn to make sure we're always drawing cards. The next 2 creatures I'm going to talk about are just kind of like some big extra bodies, but they do provide some additional functionality for the deck. The first one here is Archfiend of Depravity. This is 3 and 2 black for a creature demon. It is a 5/4 with flying and says at the beginning of each opponent's end step, that player chooses up to 2 creatures he or she controls and then sacrifices the rest. Not only is this a big creature with flying, but this is going to just wreck our opponent's boards, have them potentially sacrifice a ton of things, and just make sure that Carmen can continue to swing in and also get really big. And then, of course, we also have Sun Titan. This is 4 and 2 white for a total of 6 mana. You get a creature giant. It is a 6/6 with vigilance, and it says whenever it enters the battlefield or attacks, you may return target permanent card with mana value of 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. So this is an extra recursion piece, kind of like what we have with Carmen, but it is kind of nice whenever you are capable of chaining these kinds of cards together. So in the case that Sun Titan is in your graveyard, if Carmen is big enough, you can always swing in, recur Sun Titan, which will then grab something else too. It helps to just kind of like rapidly put you back into the game if somebody has maybe tried to board wipe and you still have Carmen around.
Man, what I'm seeing so far, this deck is looking super mean. Just a whole bunch of sacrifice effects, bringing back sacrifice effects. It's starting to terrify me.
That's the plan.
What else do we got?
So we have a couple more creatures to talk about. These next 2 still care about the sacrifice game, as well as just provide, once again, extra avenues for us to be able to hurt our opponents. The first card here is Ranger Captain of Eos. This is 1 and 2 white for a creature human soldier. It is a 3/3 and says whenever it enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a creature card with converted mana cost of 1 or less, reveal it, put it into your hand, and then shuffle your library. And we do have several targets with that, including both Mother of Runes and Giver of Runes, which are really important for this deck and being able to make sure that Carmen stays around. The other really important thing about Ranger Captain of Eos that is going to be really annoying for our opponents is that we can sacrifice him, and he says your opponents can't cast non-creature spells this turn. This is something that we could potentially just keep looping with Carmen to make sure that our opponents have very limited interaction for us. And then, of course, we're going to be putting Veto Thorn of the Dusk Rose into this list. This is 2 and a black for a legendary creature, Vampire Cleric. It is a 1/3 and says whenever you gain life, target opponent loses that much life. It also has an ability where you can pay 3 and 2 black, and it says creatures you control gain lifelink until end of turn. With Carmen in play, that we should hopefully have a pretty big beater, so that potential lifelink is very scary whenever our opponents are going to be losing that much life. And also, Veto is going to trigger with Carmen in play every time whenever our opponents sacrifice something. So this could be a lot of damage that Veto is going to get away with. Another quick little thing to notice just about this is that Veto being included into the deck also does combo off with Exquisite Blood, which was included in the Precon and is still going to be included in this $300 version.
Yeah, man, that's super mean. You make someone sacrifice stuff, and you're gonna hit him for damage because you're gaining life.
Oh,
Potentially
yes.
hit them, but I'm sure you'd be like, "Oh, bummer, you guys also lose life."
And the last 2 creatures that I'm throwing in here, these are just generally really good creatures to have. The first of which is Dothy Voidwalker. This is 2 black for a creature, Dothy Rogue. It is a 3/2 with Shadow. That means that this creature can only block or be blocked by creatures with Shadow. It also says that if a card would be put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, instead exile it with a Void counter on it, which is great for all of the removal that this deck is packing because we don't want them to have fun with their toys once we get rid of it. And then the last little piece here is we can actually tap it and sacrifice Dothy Voidwalker and choose one of the exiled cards an opponent owns with a void counter on it. You may play it this turn without paying its mana cost. And what's better than getting one Dothy Voidwalker when you can just loop them with a commander?
Yeah, that seems pretty good, man. Just keep Dauthi Voidwalker just keeps coming back over and over and over again.
I know, and every time it comes back, it brings a new free spell that you have that I didn't cast, or
True.
that I didn't have to pay for it to cast. And then, of course, I couldn't get away with not including this card in a deck just because of how much of a powerhouse it is. I know it's not necessarily on theme, but I mean, we are playing Orzhov, and we have a 5-mana commander. This deck is not the fastest thing out there, so we gotta slow the game down a little bit. So we're gonna be throwing in Drannith Magistrate. It is 1 and white for a creature human wizard. It is a 1/3 and says your opponents can't cast spells from anywhere other than their hand. Drannith Magistrate is a massive pain in the butt to deal with in pretty much every single deck. And given the fact that if our opponents do destroy it, we can just bring it back. Drannith Magistrate is going to eat so much hate that Carmen won't.
Very true. I hate that card when it's played against me. Well, that seems like all the creatures. Let's move on to some of the instants you're throwing into the deck.
Yeah, not many here. Only 2 instants that we're going to be bringing in. The first of which is Path to Exile. The deck does already include Swords to Plowshare, so we were halfway there. But I mean, we can't forget about its best friend. So Path to Exile, a single white mana for an instant. Exile target creature. Its controller may search their library for a basic land card, put the card onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle. It doesn't get much better than that. We are also going to be putting in an additional piece of removal here, and this being Stroke of Midnight, one of the brand new cards out of Eldraine. This is 2 and a white for an instant. It says destroy target non-land permanent. Its controller creates a 1/1 white human creature token. That is okay. We're going to give them sacrifice fodder. That 1/1 is not going to do anything except for probably just die.
And pump up your commander.
And pump up our commander.
All right. Let's move on to the sorceries.
Yeah, so not a whole lot here whenever it comes to the sorcery front either. We have 3 of them in total. The first of which is Diabolic Intent. This is 1 and a black for a sorcery that says, as an additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice a creature. It says, search your library for a card, put that card into your hand, then shuffle. So it is a tutor that also triggers our commander. We're also going to be bumping up our board wipes whenever it comes to this build, and we're going to be throwing in Toxic Deluge. This is 2 and a black for a sorcery that says, as an additional cost to cast this spell, pay X life, and all creatures get -X until end of turn. So it'll deal with big things, it'll deal with indestructible things, it kills just about everything. And then the last sorcery we're going to be including here is Buried Alive. This is 2 and a black for a sorcery that says, search your library for up to 3 creature cards, put them into your graveyard, then shuffle your library. Remember those 5 creature cards that I talked about at the very beginning of this video that are so important to locking down a board state? Well, Buried Alive lets you just go find them, as well as any other utility creatures you want for Carmen to just recur.
Yeah, super, super good for this deck. I like it. I like all 3 of these ads here. They all work pretty well. How about an artifact?
Yep, just 1, but this is an artifact that I actually really do love. This is Expedition Map. So for a single mana, you get an artifact that says you can pay 2, tap it, and sacrifice it, and search your library for a land card. Reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle. Now, super important note there if you've never played with this card is that you can go find any land from your deck, and we've got some rather nasty includes. As far as our mana base goes, we can go grab some of our bigger, more impactful lands off Expedition Map. It also triggers our commander, and then of course, our commander can grab permanent cards from our graveyard, not just creatures, which means if we need to, we can grab Expedition Map and go grab some more nasty lands.
Unlimited ramping. That sounds pretty good. How about some enchantments?
2 enchantments here, and they both kind of do the same thing. If you watch the $100 upgrade video, you would have already seen these as well, but these cards just put in so much work in these kinds of strategies. The first of which is Dictate of Erebos. This is 3 and 2 black for an enchantment with flash. It says whenever a creature you control dies, each opponent sacrifices a creature, which just basically prevents all of your opponents from having board states, and especially if you can get one of those first 5 creatures in play, oh man, they're going to start dying and killing off 2 things from your opponent each time. We've also got Grave Pact, which is 1 and 3 black for a total of 4 mana. It is an enchantment and says whenever a creature you control dies, each other player sacrifices a creature. These both just wreck board states.
They certainly do. I've said it before. I'm not the biggest fan when I see these are played. You tend to play them against me. It makes me sad.
The only player who is allowed to have things is me.
That seems about right. Speaking of having things, I see one thing in the form of a planeswalker.
Yeah, we do have one Planeswalker, kind of the queen of sacrifice herself. We have Liliana, Dreadhorde General. This is 4 and 2 black for a total of 6 mana. You get a legendary Planeswalker, Liliana. She enters with 6 loyalty, and she also says whenever a creature you control dies, draw a card. She's got 3 abilities on her. The first ability is a +1 that says create a 2/2 black zombie creature token. It's a nice little sacrifice fodder for us. The second ability is a -4 that says each player sacrifices 2 creatures. And then the last mode on her, if you do manage to get to it, is a -9 that says each opponent chooses a permanent they control of each permanent type and sacrifice the rest.
Yeah, you said it yourself. The Queen of Sac. Liliana Dreadhorde General. Really, really good in this deck.
Yeah, she has a tendency to just kind of take over games on her own, and with just all of these insane synergies with the rest of the deck, and of course with the commander, I could not exclude her from this list.
Understandable. And you did mention with Expedition Map, you have some spicy lands you wanted to throw in here, so let's get right into it. Talk to me about these lands.
We do have some spicy lands. Before I dive in with the spice, though, I do want to talk a little bit more about just mana fixing in general. Fortunately, with this being a 2-color deck, the mana base in the Precon isn't terrible, although it's also still not great. So the first card that I want to be throwing in here is Shattered Sanctum. This is a land that says it enters the battlefield tapped unless you control 2 or more other lands. Pretty easy to do in a deck like this. And it can tap for either a white or a black. The second card here is a pain land of these colors. This is Caves of Koilos. You can tap it for a colorless, or you can tap it for either a white or a black, and it'll deal 1 damage to you. I'm also going to be including the pathway for these colors. So there's going to be a Bright Climb pathway. On the front half, you can have it enter as a land that can tap for a white, and on the back half, you can have it enter as a land that will tap for a black. Just a nice little bit of flexibility. Do keep in mind, this is not going to help you out bouncing back and forth. So once you declare which side you're on, it's just going to pretty much stay there. It just gives you a little bit of flexibility in that it does what you need it to in the moment. We also have Marsh Flats, which is the fetch land of these colors. This is a land that you can tap it, pay 1 life, sacrifice Marsh Flats, search your library for a plains or swamp card, put it on the battlefield, and then shuffle. So a nice little fetch here, and not only is this going to trigger our commander, but this is going to also make sure that we always hit our land drops. If we need to, we can reanimate this with Carmen. The last piece for our mana fixing here is going to be Vault of Champions. This is a land that enters the battlefield tapped unless you have 2 or more opponents, and it can tap for either a white or a black. And here's the part that you were probably looking for. Here is where we get to the fun and the spice of these lands. The first one here that we're going to mention is Phyrexian Tower. This is a legendary land that taps for a colorless, or you can tap it, sacrifice a creature, and add 2 black. So a little bit of ramp, a little bit of death, and a little bit of pump and Carmen. We have Urborg, Tomb of Yawgmoth. This is a legendary land that says each land is a swamp in addition to its other land types. So that includes this one. Now, the neat little thing about Urborg is that it also turns all of your opponent's lands into swamps as well, although that may not necessarily actually matter. However, we do have 2 other really big ramp cards here, the first of which being Nykthos, Shrine to Nyx. This is a legendary land that will tap for a colorless, or you can pay 2 mana, tap it, choose a color, and add to your mana pool an amount of mana of that color equal to your devotion to that color. This deck is primarily black. It is actually 60% black. So it is capable of generating a pretty significant amount of mana off that. And then, of course, with us having Urborg in the deck, we also have Cabal Coffers. This is a land that you can pay 2 mana, tap it, and it will add a black mana for each swamp you control. So these cards really capable of just kind of getting out of control as far as like mana production goes. That way, in the case of Carmen does end up getting killed off a couple of times, you can always afford to drop her back into play. We also have Wasteland in this list because, I mean, we can reanimate our lands, so why not? Wasteland is a land that you can tap for a colorless, or you can tap it, sacrifice it to destroy target non-basic land and make your opponents very sad. And then the last land, if you have been watching any of our videos, you knew that this one was going to be included because I can't just not include it. It's one of my favorite lands in all of Magic. This is War Room. This is a land that you can tap to add a colorless, or you can pay 3, tap it, pay life equal to the number of your colors and your commander's color identity, and draw a card.
Yeah, all these lands, whether it be mana fixing, whether it be the spicy cards, these are really good in the deck. I am terrified of you sacrificing Wasteland to continuously get it back to destroy people's lands. That sounds awful.
I mean, it's not necessarily in here for like an actual like land destruction piece, but it is nice to be able to have something to interact with some of the pesky lands our opponents might play. So, Wasteland going to be providing a degree of utility.
Yeah, just a little bit, right? Is that going to do it for all of your additions?
That is going to do it for all of our editions. There's quite a bit with this. I do apologize. Normally, with these decks, we do try to focus on the 100 and then expand off that for the 300. Obviously, however, with me switching gears and actually choosing a different commander, it meant that I was putting all $300 directly into a new build. So that's kind of why we are seeing such a massive influx of new cards.
Totally makes sense. You're trying to make this deck even better with Carmen, Rule Skymarcher, and I can see why. But let's go ahead. We've added all of those cards. Now we have to make room for all those cards. So hit me. What are we removing to make that room?
The first card that we're going to be getting rid of is Sorin, Lord of Innistrad, which was the Planeswalker included in the Precon. This is 2, a white, and a black for our legendary Planeswalker Sorin. It comes in with 3 loyalty, and he has 3 abilities. The first of which is a +1 that says create a 1/1 black vampire creature token with lifelink. The second is a -2 that says you get an emblem with creatures you control get +1/+0. And the ultimate is a -6 that says destroy up to 3 target creatures and or other planeswalkers. Return each card put into the graveyard this way to the battlefield under your control. He does a lot, but as odd as it is, I'm not really impressed with any of these modes. The small little vampire tokens are cute, but not really all that impactful. The emblem, same kind of thing. Our commander is capable of growing very quickly, and a +1/+0 is probably not going to help it out by much. And then I don't actually think Soren's going to be able to get to that ultimate very often, so it's kind of flavor text.
Yeah, I can see why you're cutting this in favor of Liliana, especially. Liliana's doing so much more in this deck than Sorin would. But a 1-to-1 swap for Planeswalkers? How about some creature swaps?
We are going to be making some creature swaps, and I know this is the part where you're going to go down to the comments and you're going to be like, what in the world, dude? Why are you removing so many vampires? Well, not all the vampires that were included in the precon were actually all that good, and some of them were just kind of actually clunky. Not only just like in this build, but just in the precon in general. So there's quite a few cards here that I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of. And to lead into it, we're going to start with Bloodghast. Bloodghast is 2 black mana for a creature vampire spirit. It is a 2/1, and it says it cannot block. It also says that it has haste as long as an opponent has 10 or less life, and both of those are not great. The inability to block here is not fantastic, meaning that you basically have to be able to sacrifice this thing in order for it to die because, well, let's be real, your opponents are not going to be scared of a 2/1. And the haste aspect here, also not very impactful. The saving grace on this card is that it does have landfall and says whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you may return Bloodghast from your graveyard to the battlefield, but I don't even really care much for Bloodghast as a sacrifice target, at least not in this build. Bloodline Necromancer is another card going to be removed here. This is 4 and a black for a creature vampire wizard. It is a 3/2 with lifelink and says whenever it enters the battlefield, you may return target vampire or wizard creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. We are going to be cutting a pretty decent number of vampires here, and I'm not super impressed with paying 5 mana for a 3/2 with lifelink that doesn't really do anything after you've used its ETB. Now, yes, you can always loop this thing with Carmen to be able to make sure that your board is going to be well stocked with vampires, but this does have a mana value of 5, which means that Carmen does have to put in at least a little bit of work in order to reanimate this. Blood Tracker is up next. This is 3 and a black for a total of 4 mana. It is a creature vampire wizard. It's a 2/2 with flying, and it has an ability where you may pay a black 2 life to put a +1/+1 counter on it. It also says whenever it leaves the battlefield, you draw a card for each +1/+1 counter on it. Blood Tracker is a card that I played with a lot, and I always feel like this card just reads so much better than it actually plays. I don't know if I have ever really been able to draw any cards off of this. I'm never really that big of a fan of sinking extra mana into my 2/2 to make it a 3/3, as well as nuking my life total to make this thing relevant. I'm just not a big fan of Blood Tracker in just about any build, especially not here. Vona, Butcher of Magan, is 3 a white and a black for a total of 5 mana. It is a legendary creature vampire knight. It's a 4/4 with vigilance and lifelink, and it has an ability where you may tap it, pay 7 life to destroy target non-land permanent, activate only during your turn. It's a 5 mana 4/4 with Vigilance, Lifelink, and another ability that I have never been able to use. Either because this card is really expensive and incredibly slow, as well as hurting me for a ton, or I just never actually have a target that's meaningful enough for this. This being activated only during my turn really kind of just kills all of my interest for this card.
Yeah, Vona's going to be the new bad vampire moving forward now that Vito's dead. So we'll see if they get a better card later down the line, but this card isn't that good.
Up next, we have Order of Sacred Dusk. This is 6, a white, and a black for a total of 8 mana. It is a creature vampire knight. It's a 5/5 with Convoke, and it says your creatures can help to cast a spell. Each creature you tap while casting the spell pays for either 1 or 1 mana of that creature's color. This 5/5 has flying, lifelink, and haste, and exalted, and other vampires you control have exalted. So there is a lot going on with this card. However, this is still starting at 8 mana. It is still very expensive. You're never going to be able to reanimate this thing. It's just never going to be chosen as the target, even if you do happen to have 8 power with Carmen. And then the other thing here being, too, is that it's not even all that super impactful once it is in play. Up next, we have Nighthawk Scavenger. This is 1 and 2 black for a total of 3 mana. It is a creature vampire rogue. It has flying, death touch, and lifelink, and it says that its power is equal to 1 plus a number of card types amongst cards in your opponent's graveyards. This card sounds neat. It is supposed to be like the fixed version, or I guess the altered version of like a vampire Nighthawk, and it has a lot of really cool abilities on here. Flying, death touch, and lifelink are all fantastic. However, that's kind of all that this does. I've never really been the biggest fan of this card. It's just, I don't know, a little too close to vanilla for me to really do much with it. And I just think that there's better options.
Yeah, also a ceiling on its power, too. You can't just continue to go up. It's stuck on a certain amount of card types.
Also stuck on its toughness, which means this thing still dies to a lot. Up next, we're going to be cutting Oathsworn Vampire. This is 1 and a black for a creature vampire knight. It is a 2/2, and it says that it enters the battlefield tapped. It also says you may cast it from your graveyard if you've gained life this turn. That's actually fairly easy to do with this deck. We still have a pretty decent number of life gainers. However, this is just kind of like a repeatable sacrifice fodder piece. I wanted to move away from value creatures that like we wanted to sacrifice them over to other creatures that either had the ability to sacrifice themselves, or some creatures that whenever we sacrificed them, we're making our opponent sacrifice things too to kind of limit their board state. Oathsworn Vampire just not quite doing enough for me here. Marvin Fane, Dusk Apostle, is also getting removed. This is 2 in a white for a total of 3 mana. It is a legendary creature vampire cleric. It's a 2/2, and it says whenever 1 or more non-token vampires you control attack, create a 1/1 white vampire creature token with lifelink. This is not a good token production card to begin with because it's only going to be making 1 per turn. This does have that card opportunity cost where it's going to eat up a slot in your deck, and I don't want to play bad cards just because they're somewhat flavorful.
Yeah, I get why these are removed. It's just not doing what your deck wants to do anymore.
Up next, we have Timothar, Baron of Bats. This is 4 and 2 black for a total of 6 mana. It is a legendary creature vampire noble, a 4/4 with ward that says discard a card. It also says whenever another non-token vampire you control dies, you may pay 1 and exile it. If you do, create a 1/1 black bat creature token with flying. It gains whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, sacrifice it, and return the exiled card to the battlefield tapped. This is, in and of itself, a fairly decent value engine in our dedicated sacrifice deck. However, this thing costs 6 mana. I really wanted to focus on lowering our mana curve, and coming in at 6 mana and not necessarily doing a whole lot to actually like pump our board state up as far as like progressing it. I just felt like Timothar wasn't doing enough here. Timothar is really good if we do happen to have an already established board, but at that point, just makes me question, is this a win more card? And then we are going to be cutting Redemption Choir. This is 2 and 2 white for a total of 4 mana. It is a creature vampire cleric. It is a 3/3 with lifelink and coven. That says whenever it enters the battlefield or attacks, if you control 3 or more creatures with different powers, return target permanent card with mana value of 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. I actually do like this card half the time, and that half the time is whenever it has an ability. But aside from that, whenever this thing is not turned on, it is 4 mana for a 3/3 with lifelink, and that is just not relevant. Redemption Choir has a nice upside to it, but it has a really low floor.
Yeah, I totally understand. I wasn't the biggest fan of Coven either. It's does nothing until you could turn that on, and you're not guaranteed to turn that on either. So I can see the reasoning.
Sadly, we are going to be getting rid of a card with some really dope artwork, and that being Master of Dark Rites. For a single black mana, you get a creature, Vampire Cleric. It is a 1/1 that you can tap it, sacrifice another creature, and add 3 black mana to your mana pool. It says spend this mana only to cast Vampire Cleric and or Demon spells. Now, if you haven't noticed yet, we're removing a lot of vampires from this list. Don't worry, the majority of creatures in this list are still vampires. So take a look at the 300 on Moxfield before you comment down below. I promise they're still there. There's still a lot of targets for this card. However, I do feel like it is somewhat slow. This is going to tap itself down, sacrifice another creature. So this is kind of like getting rid of 2 pieces of your board state, at least kind of like functionality wise. And yes, 3 black mana is a lot, and we do still have hits here. I just felt like with this not being a dedicated Vampire Cleric or Demon deck per se, it didn't quite feel right. Speaking about not being dedicated enough to make the list, we also have Legion Lieutenant. This is a white and a black for a creature vampire knight. It says other vampires you control get +1/+1, and it is a 2/2. We still have a fairly decent number of vampires, but in truth, I'm actually not really super interested in attacking with most of them. The only one that I really want to be swinging in with every single turn is our commander. And Carmen doesn't really do a whole lot with it, an additional +1/+1 whenever she's capable of just getting so much more. Up next, we have Martyr of Dusk. This is 1 and white for a creature vampire soldier. It is a 2/1 that says whenever it dies, create a 1/1 white vampire creature token with lifelink. I don't like these kinds of effects. I don't like these kinds of cards. This is not good as a normal creature with the actual card, and I don't care about a 1/1 white vampire creature token. So this thing is just, it's going to get the axe. It is not impactful enough to be a slot in the deck. Dusk Legion Sergeant is 1 and a black for a creature vampire soldier. It is a 2/2 with menace that you can pay 1 and a black and sacrifice it. And it says each non-token vampire creature you control gains persist until end of turn. That means that whenever it dies, if it had no -1/-1 counters on it, return it to the battlefield under its owner's control with a -1/-1 counter on it. Now, yes, this does have the potential to save Carmen, but so does Selfless Spirit, and Selfless Spirit also means that it's going to keep all those counters and just be indestructible.
I like the swap there. You got a couple of different creatures that can protect your commander compared to this.
Sadly, for all of those of you that really loved the $100 video, we're getting rid of them. In the $300, Clavalinho, First of the Blast, is getting the axe. This is 1 a white, a black for a legendary creature, Vampire Cleric. It is a 2/2 that says whenever you attack, target attacking vampire that isn't a demon becomes a demon in addition to its other types. It gains when this creature dies, draw a card and create a tapped 4/3 white and black vampire demon creature token with flying. I have had the opportunity now to play with the $100 deck a couple of times, really being able to dive in and play test it. And the more I played the deck, the less I actually liked Clavalinho. I just felt like he's a little slow and kind of clunky. And in this deck where we are removing a lot of vampires, he just loses even more value. So with that being said, he's not sticking around. And then the last creature card that we're going to be cutting here is Crossway Troublemakers. This is 5 and a black for a creature vampire to the 5/5, and it says attacking vampires you control have Death Touch and Lifelink. It also says whenever a vampire you control dies, you may pay 2 life if you do draw a card. In truth, I love that first ability. This would give our commander Death Touch and Lifelink, meaning we gain a ton of extra life. And I guess whatever blocked it died, although whatever blocked it is probably going to die anyways because Carmen gets big. The reason why I don't like this card, though, is because it's 6 mana. And it is only a 5/5. If this thing had an additional ability, if it maybe had flying or menace, I might consider it. I'm just not really here for it.
Yeah, I can see why you cut all of these creatures out of the deck to make room for those other even better ones. They just pair much better than these ones do with Carmen. And the way Carmen wants to pilot the deck, those creatures aren't doing it. But we did see that you added some sorceries. I do see a sorcery being removed.
Yeah, so the sorcery we're going to be cutting here is New Blood. This is 2 and 2 black for a sorcery that says, as an additional cost to cast a spell, tap an untapped vampire you control. It says, gain control of target creature. Change the text of that creature by replacing all instances of one creature type with vampire. This card isn't bad. However, I do feel like for the most part, these kind of like steal your card effects are never actually as impactful as I want them to be. They temporarily slow down my opponent, but so does a kill spell, and this costing 4 mana, I just felt like there's better options out there, especially considering that this deck is pretty jam-packed with removal and forcing our opponents to sacrifice things to begin with, so it's just not putting in enough work.
Yeah, understandable. Speaking of removal, we did add some removal. I'm seeing some instants that are being removed.
Yeah, I'm going to be cutting Utter End. This is 2, a white and a black for an instant that says exile target non-land permanent. Uh, Utter End is a fine card. However, with this upgrade, we've chosen to also include Stroke of Midnight. Now, Stroke of Midnight doesn't exile, it only destroys, but coming in at only 3 mana and costing 1 color less, I do like that extra degree of flexibility. Utter End is still a fine card, but I just feel like Stroke of Midnight is just a bit better. And then also, I'm going to be removing Return to Dust. This is 2 and 2 white for 4 mana. It's an instant that says exile target artifact or enchantment, and if you cast a spell during your main phase, you may exile up to 1 other target artifact or enchantment. Maybe this is just my personal bias. This is not a card that I'm ever really the biggest fan of. I don't like the fact that it costs 4, and I don't think I've ever been able to exile 2 things just because I always find myself in a bind where I need to instant speed remove something, and then I only get 1 instance of this instead of the 2.
Yeah, that's where it gets you. Really wants you to play this on the main phase. So it's going to cost a little extra, but at the same time, it's an instant. So it's going to cost less, but not do as cool things.
Yep.
And moving on to the artifacts that you've removed.
So the first card that I removed here is Glasscast Heart. This is 2 and a black for an artifact. It says whenever 1 or more vampires you control attack, you'll create a blood token. It also has an ability where you can pay a black tap it, pay 1 life, and create a 1/1 white and black vampire creature token with lifelink. And another ability where you can pay 2 black tap it, sacrifice Glasscast Heart, and 13 blood tokens. Each opponent loses 13 life, and you gain 13 life. This is a card that I actually just flat out kind of don't think is very good, even in a dedicated vampire deck. Yes, blood tokens are pretty neat. However, the other abilities on this card are really not that great. I don't care about the token production, and especially with that only being once per turn and costing me life. And even if I do happen to have 13 blood tokens lying around, having each opponent drained for 13 and me gain 13 life really doesn't do anything more than just put a target on my back. So I'm not a big fan of this card. I'm also going to be removing both pieces of equipment that were included in the Precon, the first of which being Blade of the Blood Chief. This is a single mana for an artifact equipment. It says whenever a creature dies, put a +1/+1 counter on the equipped creature, and if the equipped creature is a vampire, put 2 +1/+1 counters on it instead. It has an equip cost of 1. Now, yes, our deck is jam-packed with removal, and Blade of the Blood Chief has the potential to go absolutely nuts. The reason why I'm cutting this card is because I don't actually think we need it. I think that Carmen just grows big enough on her own, given the additional support that we have, that Blade of the Blood Chief, as odd as it sounds for this being a cheap card, is just kind of win more. And with that being said, it's just kind of like, this is card opportunity cost. Do I want to include something else, or just another card that I think is just going to like push us over the edge whenever we're kind of already there? And then the last equipment that I'm going to be removing is Heirloom Blade. This is 3 mana for an artifact equipment. It says the equipped creature gets +3/+1. It also says whenever the equipped creature dies, you may reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a creature card that shares a creature type with it. Put that card into your hand and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order, and you pay 1 to equip. We did remove quite a bit of vampires here. I do love that this is also going to be like card advantage and that you're going to be restocking your hand. However, there's just not really enough here in this deck to really make me want Heirloom Blade. This is just another piece of equipment that I think is going to get cut due to opportunity cost and just us having better cards that we can play with.
Yeah, I keep saying the same thing over and over again, but these just don't make sense in the deck you're building. So I can see why you got these out. And finally, let's move on to the final spells, it looks like. Talk to me about these enchantments that are coming out.
Yeah, apparently I just don't like enchantments because we are cutting 5 of them. The first of which is Etchings of the Chosen. This is 1, a white, and a black. It says whenever it enters the battlefield, choose a creature type. The creature of that chosen type, it gets +1/+1, and then you can pay 1, sacrifice a creature of the chosen type, and target creature you control gains indestructible until end of turn. There's a lot going on with this card. However, we don't actually have like a ton of vampires. We've only got about 20 in the deck. The little buff there is cute, but it's not actually doing a whole lot for us. And we can use this as sacrifice to just like be able to start sacrificing things to trigger Carmen, but even still, I don't typically want to do that. Etchings of the Chosen is a weird card that I just don't feel like ever really plays all that great for me. Kindred Boon is kind of similar. This is 2 and 2 white for a total of 4 mana. It's an enchantment that says whenever it enters the battlefield, choose a creature type. You can pay 1 and a white to put a divinity counter on target creature you control of the chosen type, and each creature you control with a divinity counter on it has indestructible. So this is a great way for us to be able to give our commander indestructible for 6 mana. It's just the fact that this is really slow, and our opponents do have the ability to interact with this at instant speed still. I just feel like this is kind of telegraphed, and it's not actually really helping us. Another one of the enchantments we're going to be removing is March of the Canonized. This is X and 2 white for an enchantment that says whenever it enters the battlefield, you'll create X/1/1 white vampire creature tokens with lifelink. It also says at the beginning of your upkeep, if your devotion to white and black is 7 or greater, you'll create a 4/3 white and black vampire demon creature token with flying. I do not like cards that I have to sink a million mana into for them to be good, and this is one of those cards. I do not care much for this. I don't think this is doing much just on its first ability, and I don't think that its second ability, even whenever it does finally kick, is really all that relevant. So I'm going to pass on this card. We also have Promise of Aclazotz. This is 1 and a black for a total of 2 mana. It is an enchantment that also happens to have an adventure. The adventure portion of it is a sorcery that says Foul Rebirth. You may pay 2 and a black. It says sacrifice a non-demon creature. If you do, create a 4/3 white and black vampire creature demon with flying. And then, of course, it also says at the beginning of your end step, you may sacrifice a non-demon creature. If you do, populate. This is not a token deck anymore. We are no longer really trying to go with a vampire demon theme, so the populate doesn't actually do much for us. I'm going to pass on this card. The final enchantment that we're going to be cutting is Radiant Destiny. This is 2 and a white for an enchantment with Ascend. For those of you who do not remember, Ascend says if you control 10 or more permanents, you get the city's blessing for the rest of the game. It says whenever it enters the battlefield, choose a creature type, and creatures you control of the chosen type get +1/+1. As long as you have the city's blessing, they also have Vigilance. Radiant Destiny is just not a card that I'm super high on. I do like Vigilance, especially with our commander. However, it's something that we're not always going to have access to the city's blessing, so we're not always going to get that.
Yeah, once again, understandable why you cut all these enchantments out of the deck. And finally, David, we went ahead and we added a whole bunch of lands to make the mana base even better. Obviously, we can't keep as many lands as we're adding. So what are we taking out of the deck?
We're going to be cutting a decent number of our lands, just kind of trimming the fat. The first card here is Orzhov Basilica. This is a land that always enters the battlefield tapped. Whenever it does enter the battlefield, it's going to bounce another land you control back to your hand. And later on, you can tap it for both a white and a black. And although tapping for this for 2 mana is cool, I really don't like the loss of tempo. I really don't like that this thing comes in tapped. And this is a deck that does care about reanimating our creatures, but I mean, like, this is not a deck that's trying to reanimate and cheat in, like, really big things. We can still afford to cast most of the creatures we're going to reanimate later on. So Orzhov Basilica is not a card that I want to like use to pitch a creature early on in the game for. This card is just slow, and I don't need a slow card in a deck that revolves around a 5 mana commander. So up next, we have Shine Shadow Snarl. This is a land that says whenever it enters the battlefield, you may reveal a Plains or Swamp card from your hand. If you don't, it enters the battlefield tapped, and you can tap it for either a white or a black. I don't like that caveat. I normally, whenever I play these kinds of cards, they enter the battlefield tapped, so I'm not the biggest fan here. Just don't like how slow these are. We do have a couple of lands that really care about specific creature types here. The first of which being Secluded Courtyard. It says whenever it enters the battlefield, choose a creature type. You're going to tap it for either a colorless, or you can tap it to add 1 mana of your mana pool, but spend that mana only to cast a creature spell of the chosen type, or to activate an ability of a creature source of the chosen type. This means that we're not using this mana for instants or sorceries or any of the other really cool things that we have in our deck. This is only actually going to tap for a color for like 20 cards in the deck. It's just not good enough to see play here. Unclaimed Territory is a victim of the exact same thing. It says it enters the battlefield tapped and choose a creature type. You can tap it for a colorless. You can tap it, add 1 mana of any color, and spend that mana only to cast creature spells of the chosen type. Just not going to be doing it for us. Temple of Silence is a land that enters the battlefield tapped, and you know how I feel about those. Whenever it enters the battlefield, you scry 1, and you can tap it for either a white or a black, but that enter the battlefield tap thing just completely kills this card for me. Temple of the False God is an awful card that you should just never include in any of your decks. This is a land that you can tap for 2 colorless mana, but you can only activate it if you control 5 or more lands. So long as you only have 4 lands, Temple of the False God literally does absolutely nothing. This is always in my opening hand whenever it is included in a deck that I am playing, if it has it in the list. So Temple of the False God is one of the first cards that I remove. Myriad Landscape is another land that I'm actually not a big fan of. It enters the battlefield tapped. You can tap it to add a colorless, or you can pay 2, tap it, sacrifice it, search your library for up to 2 basic land cards that share a land type, put them onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle. Yes, this is repeatable ramp with Carmen if we do choose to reanimate this, but that means we're also not reanimating something else, and Myriad Landscape is not great. Windbrisk Heights is a land with Hideaway 4. That means whenever it enters the battlefield, you may look at the top 4 cards of your library, exile one of the cards face down, and then forget about that ability because you're never going to be able to cast it. It does also have to say whenever it enters the battlefield, it comes in tapped. You can tap it for a white mana, and you can tap it. And it also has a flavor text on it where you can pay a white and tap it, and it says you may play the exiled card without paying its mana cost if you attacked with 3 or more creatures this turn. We're attacking with Carmen. I don't know if we're ever attacking with anything else. Windbrisk Heights basically just takes one of your cards and gets rid of it forever. Get rid of this card. Voldaren Estate is a land that taps for a colorless. You can tap it, pay 1 life, add 1 mana of any color, spend that mana only to cast vampire spells. You can also pay 5 mana and tap it to create a blood token. This ability costs 1 less to activate for each vampire you control. Blood tokens are cool, not for 5. Good thing we have a couple of vampires in here to reduce the cost. But even at that, we're going to be using our mana for different things instead. And finally, to wrap up this deck list and this mana base, we are removing 1 plains and 1 swamp. Just making room for some of the other lands we included in here that have the ability to tap for maybe 1 or multiple colors.
Is that going to do it? Is that all of your entire $300 upgrade to Blood Rites featuring Carmen, Cruel Skymarcher as the commander?
Well, now that you've listened to me talk about this deck for the last 45 minutes, no. In fact, actually, yeah, this is all of it. I'm so sorry. I am so sorry for making a video this long. I really do actually enjoy Carmen. I think she is a ton of fun. Looking back, hindsight being 2020, I probably should have just started with her for the 100. But I did think that this was a deck that, I don't know, Clavileno just kind of exhausted himself. I felt like at the $100 level, there wasn't really a whole lot for me to do with 300, and I felt like Carmen just had more that she could do with that budget.
Well, all right. Speaking of budget, we gave you $300. What is the total amount of money you spent on all of the additions for this deck?
So as of the time of this recording, this deck does come up to about $280. It's a bit below that $300 marker. So if you did want to include any other ads, feel free to it. I just kind of stopped myself at a certain point because I felt like, well, we've already talked for like 45 minutes, and I swear I've covered 600 cards in this video.
All right. You made it underneath that $300 threshold. Like David said, if you wanted to add more to it, you could. Completely up to you. But go out there and check out this deck. Go buy it for yourself. Play around with it. I'm sure it's a lot of fun. And if you wanted to see the entire deck list, check the description down below where you'll find a link to our Moxfield account. David, before we say goodbye to the people, do you want to add anything else?
Yeah, go ahead, make your comments down below as to what you would have done differently with this deck or a different direction. Go ahead and also make sure that you comment down below and ask me to never switch gears between a 100 300 and do such a monstrous video like this again, because I don't think I want to either. So thank you so much for all your love and support. Thank you for making it to the end of this ginormous video. I apologize sincerely. I have learned my lesson.
All right. Well, like David said, comment down below letting him know if you enjoyed this upgrade, or if you didn't. Always interested to hear what you guys say. Hit that like button if you like this video. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, so you're staying up to date with all the other videos that we're doing. In the description, not only will you find that link to the Moxfield account, but you'll find links to our social media as well. That's Instagram, X, and TikTok at Guys at Magic for each one, and also a Patreon where you'll find exclusive content that you don't see on YouTube. That's right, we have Discord access, we have giveaways, we have extra bonus content. Check it out in the description. And until the next video, hope you guys have a great rest of your day. Peace.
Later.